Today on Real LCN Mob on location, we're going to talk about 14th Avenue in Brooklyn, the neighborhood that borders Borough Park, Bensonhurst, and Dyker Heights. Long known to be mob-affiliated area in the past. We got Savaris Bakery's place back in the day on 60th Street and New Utrecht Avenue. This location right here was actually the spot where in the movie French Connection there was a chase scene and the criminal fell actually in between the tracks and landed right there in this intersection of 60th Street and 14th Avenue in New Utrecht. In the movie it is. Savaris Bakery. Up the block, about a block and a half up, is where the associate Joey Farmer's house was, where the feds actually raided it back in the mid-90s, I believe, or early 90s, and broke the walls down, finding cash and guns as well. The neighborhood is now predominantly Jewish to the north and east, and then you have a lot of Mexicans and Salvadorians in the area. As you could tell, it's a bit of a slum type area at this time. All of New York City is pretty bad right now under the current regime. As you could see, a lot of garbage thrown around. But let's get back to the story. This is the New Utrecht Avenue train station, NND lines. And up the block used to be the L'Amour's East Rock Club. They used to play metal and rock and roll. That was a very famous heavy metal joint back in the day, in the 80s and early 90s. Like I said, back in the 80s and 90s, 70s, 60s, going way back, this area was always mob affiliated in one way or the other. And this building right here used to be a car service, a limousine and black car service. It was called Getaway Car. So that was the car service office, the Getaway Car Service office. And it went all the way to the front for the customers. This block used to be all lined up with the cars. The guy that owned it also owned that building, if you could see down the block on the left, that apartment building. Towards the middle of the block on the left. His name was Danny Gallo, allegedly a cousin of Joey Gallo. And he owned this place back then. One time, one of the dispatchers, who was known to be a heavy gambler, we used to call him Jimbo, big fat heavy guy, I guess it was time to pay up and he didn't pay up. So the story is that he caught a beating inside the car service, and then they took his chair that he used to sit in when he would dispatch, and they put it right here in the middle of the street and they burned it. This site right here used to be, up until maybe 10 years ago or so, Santa Rosalia Church, a small Roman Catholic church allegedly built by the Italians when they first came during the late 1800s and early 1900s, which was actually the site of a big funeral for one of the first dons of Brooklyn back in the early 1900s and the 1920s. Named Frankie Yale or Frankie Uali, who ran this whole neighborhood. He was a notorious gangster. He actually found Al Capone back in the days. And it's right directly across the Royal Crown Bakery, famous Italian bakery in Brooklyn, which was also owned by a guy who was supposedly mob connected, who actually got shot in Staten Island. Now it's basically a Mexican and Chinese area. But you could still see in the buildings the old architecture from when the Italians ran the area. That building across the street also used to be the first getaway car service back in the early 80s to the mid 80s. And that yellow brick building right there used to be the Italian club. It was a Sicilian social club, a gambling hall, where Joe Piccolo used to own it, Sicilian guy, and his son Dominic used to run it. It was also the site of a murder in the late 80s of between Nick Chichi and Sal Papandrea. There was a fight, and one of them was killed right there in front in his car. His head was blown off. And that store right there during the early 90s was actually a gelateria, ice cream shop owned by Philly Dogs Mazzara from the Gambinos. And in the back used to have Joker poker machines and hold card games. On that corner of 65th and 14th Avenue, Mondial Tiles was known to be a connected company. And Joe Colombo had an office over here in this building back in the 70s and the late 60s. Raul!